Hey everybody, this is Grace. Today we are on lesson 11 and we're going to be covering reading input from files. So we've already learned to read input from the console where the user types in the input and then the program reads it in. Here we're going to be doing something different where the input is already on the file, but we just want to get it and retrieve it from that file. So there's two methods to do this, and I will show you guys both. Well, actually, there are a lot more, but these are the two probably most accessible ways for now. The first method is reading with the scanner. And so let's get started and learn how to read a file with a scanner. Now, you should be familiar with the scanner by now, super familiar, since we've been using that to read input from the console. And it can also read from a file. But before we start programming, let's figure out how to set up the Replit environment so that we can upload files or create files. This is super important to know when in this lesson, since we're going to be working with those files. All right, so once you've created your program, on the left-hand side, you should see this nice sidebar, and then you should see the word files in bold. And so there are two icons next to it. One of them is new file, and the other one is new folder. And then you have three dots, which allow you to upload a file or folder and a couple other things that we don't really need. So here today, we're going to be creating a new file and also uploading a file. So first of all, let's create a new file and make sure that this works. So when you create a new file, you're going to get this blank box and you want to give that file a name. So here we're mostly going to be working with text files today, which are essentially just words, no formatting, nothing, just characters. So let's call this hello.txt. All right, so now I've created my file. And as you can see, Replit brings me to this blank page and I'm on line 1. And up here, we can tell we're on the hello.txt file. So let me just add some random things here. Okay, so add a few lines of whatever you want. Here I have a couple lines about 8. And once you've done that, navigate back to the Java file. All right. So first of all, we definitely want to import the scanner. And we're going to set it up. Okay. So first thing I want to do is ask the user which file I want to be reading. So in this case, I only have one. It's hello.txt. So yeah, it's easy to just hard code that and type in the name into the program. But if we have a lot more files, it becomes a bit more difficult to determine which file we want and a bit inconvenient. So then I'm going to want the name of the file. Then I'm going to store that in a string called file name. All right. And so when we're working with the scanner to read files, we're going to need a try and catch statement. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth into it, but what a try catch statement does is it just lets us define a block of code that is tested for errors as it's executed. So the try statement, you can kind of think of it as an if statement. And then the catch is kind of like the else. So try is where we check, okay, does this block of code work? And then if it does, we execute what's inside of it. And then catch, we find some error, so we do something else, like return output saying that we have some sort of error. So I'm going to start by writing my try statement. And once again, like a lot of things in Java, this is enclosed in double braces. All right, so here, I'm going to create a file object that basically just stores the file I have out here. And as I'm creating the file object, I'm going to plug in the name. In this case, it's the string called fname. So this file should be like a copy of my hello.txt file. All right, here, I'm going to create another scanner. Now, I know that sounds a bit weird since we've always only used one scanner, but a scanner is an object, and in Java, we can just create as many objects as we need. And so in this case, this scanner, we're going to use for reading the file. We're not going to use the one in line 5, because this was from reading from the console. And I'm going to call this fin, short for file input. And when I create the scanner, I don't want to put system.in inside the parentheses. I'm going to put in this file. So far, it looks pretty self-explanatory. We create a file that's the same as this hello.txt file, and then we create a scanner that is meant to read this file. All right, so then how are we going to read it? Well, in the past, when we were reading in user input, we usually knew how many numbers or strings or lines of input that we wanted to read. Here, we actually don't know. I have a small file here right now, so I can just navigate to it and count that there's 8 lines. But what if it's way longer? It's not so efficient to have to search through the file you want to read and then look how many lines there are. So then what's the condition that we should be reading our file? Let's think about it. Okay, if you thought something along the lines of we should be reading the file as long as the next line isn't empty, then you are correct. Why is that? If we go by that algorithm, first line wouldn't be empty, so we will read it. Second line, also not empty. The third line is also not empty. The fourth line looks empty, but there's actually a new line character in here. We just don't see it. So technically, it's not empty, and we'll still be reading it. 5, not empty. 6, not empty. 7, same thing. There's a new line character. We just don't see it, so we will read it. And then 8 is also not empty. Then after 8, everything else here is going to be empty, right? There's no next line after 8. This is the very last line. So here, this is going to be an iterative process, but we can't really use a for loop because we don't exactly know how many times it's going to run. So instead, we're going to use a while loop. So that will be reading under a certain condition. And this certain condition is whether the file input has a next line. And there's a method that is pretty handy for this. Okay, so we confirm that the file has the next line. Now, what we're gonna want to do for now, let's keep it simple. Let's just print it out exactly. So we're gonna store the current line inside of a string called data, perhaps. Or even better, you can just call it line, something like that. Then we're going to print out this line. All right, now after we've read all of this, let's go ahead and close the file input scanner. And there we go, we're done with our try code block. Now we still need to write the catch one. And so when we catch, we're going to return a file not found exception. And why would we return this exception? Let's look at the try statement line by line. The first line we have here is creating a file object that has the exact same name as fname. But if there's no file that exists with fname, then you're obviously going to get an error, right? So we can just end here and go to the catch statement. Because if we have no file with that name, then we definitely can't be reading it. Then we can print out a message saying an error occurred. All right, there we go. We're done. We wrote a program that can read a file using a scanner. Okay, but before we run this program, we're going to want to do some more importing here. So first of all, we want to import java.io.file. So this IO package stands for input output. And then we also need to import the file not found exception. Okay, so now our code should run without a hitch. So let's run it and test it. Okay, so first we get a prompt asking for the file name. And let's see our output. And let's match it up to what's in the file. So the first line, hello world. Second line, hello. Third line is correct. Fourth line, fifth line, 6, 7, 8. Okay, nice. So our program basically copied everything from the text file to the console. So now let's talk about the second method of reading. And personally, I think this one is a little faster or maybe easier. So the second method is we're going to read with the buffered reader object in Java. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and clear some things. All right, and with the buffered reader object, you're going to want to throw an IO exception whenever you use it. So I won't go into detail why, but just remember that you need to do this on the same line as the declaration of the main method. So same thing here, we still want to know the file name. And then we're still going to store that in a string called fname. And then we're going to create a file object. So actually, we're going to still import java.io.file. Okay, now here we want to create our buffered reader object. Let's call it BR. This is usually the standard name for it. Okay, so within new buffered reader, then we're going to create a new file reader for the file object, which we called file. So up here, we're going to import the buffered reader and import the file reader. And since here we called the IO exception, we're throwing an IO exception, we also need to import that since it's part of the IO package. Okay, and at this point you might be wondering, when I'm writing programs, how do I know which packages or whether or not I should be importing this stuff? Because this is quite a lot to type. We have 5 lines of importing here. So one quick way to fix that problem is placing an asterisk after the package name. So now we don't have to import every single individual thing. We just need to, this just imports the entire package. So it's a lot more convenient. And there we go. It looks a lot neater and cleaner. Okay, so let's go back to reading with the buffered reader. So before we start reading, let's declare a string called line that's going to store the current line the buffered reader reads. And so our while loop, we're still going to use a while loop here, by the way, because once again, we don't know how many lines there are in the text file or any file, and we just want this to run on some condition. And this condition here is still going to be similar to our first method. We just want to keep reading as long as the next line isn't blank, or as long as there is a next line. So first thing I'm going to do is assign the current line to my string. Okay, and notice this assignment is in parentheses because then I'm going to do a comparison check. This line that I read cannot be null. And when I say null, let's just think of it as this line can't be blank, just like we were doing with the scanner. And then let's print out the line. Okay, so now let's run this program. All right, so let's check our output. You compare it against the text file, it's exactly the same. So this buffered reader method does the exact same thing as the scanner. Personally, I prefer it because it's just a bit easier to type out and use. With the scanner, you have to do a try and catch exception. Here, it's pretty easy. You just get straight into the reading. All right, nice. So we've learned two methods now, and I'm going to be using this method for the rest of the class. So now we learned how to read a file, and let's just play around with that a little bit. So here, let's write a program that prints out every nth line in a file. So I want to read the file name, and I still want to create a file. Now here, let me read in the integer n. All right, so now in my while loop, remember that we don't know how many lines there are in our file, so we don't really have a way to enumerate them either. So think about it for a few seconds. Think what would be the best way to determine the current line that we are on. Perhaps we can store it in a variable or something like that. Think about it. Okay, if you thought of keeping a counter variable or something like that, then you're correct. That's exactly what we're going to do. And this counter variable, we're going to start at 1. Rather than 0, because it makes sense, right? If we read the first line, then that's technically line 1. That should be counter's current value. And then we move to the next line, then we should be on line 2 after updating counter. So now, once we read in the string line, we're going to want to check if counter is divisible by 9, right? Because here we're printing out every nth line in a file. So in other words, the line number has to be a multiple of n. Okay, and so a quick if statement check with the modulus operator can tell us this. So if the counter mod n is equal to 0, we're going to print out that line. And only those lines. We don't have anything else. There's no if statement in this case. If counter doesn't satisfy this condition, then we just won't do anything. We'll just go to the next line. Okay, so let's run this. Oh, and after the if statement, don't forget to update counter. And then let's add a prompt before we read in n for some number. Okay, this should make our code a lot clearer. So we read the file, hello.txt. Let's say we just want every 3 lines. Now this is what we get. We get today is Monday and the smiley face. So let's verify this. So line 3, and then line 6. So our program works correctly. Okay, now here, let's read a text file of words and then search through it. So you can download a text file from this link, gwix.net/dictionaries.htm. So if you type in this URL, which is pretty easy, we're going to go ahead and download the first file of 84,000 words. And don't download the QTYP file. We're going to download the text one. So it's in a zip file and you may want to open it. So just clicking on the file should open it for you. And in your Files app or whatever you're using, then you should see something called engmix.txt. All right, now going back to our program, we're going to want to upload this file. So click on these three dots here. And then you should be able to find that file and just simply upload it. So now you should see it on the sidebar under all your files along with your hello.txt file. So you can open it and it looks like this. We just have a ton of words. And since there's about 84,000, don't try scrolling through all of this. All right, so I will pause for a few seconds and try and do that before we start. Okay. So now let's work with this text file a little bit. The first thing we want to do is write a program that prints out and counts the number of words starting with a given letter. So we can kind of think of this text file as a dictionary. And so if you're looking at a dictionary, you would have some sort of letter you want as you're looking for the word, and then you would be looking for it, right? So that's exactly what we're doing here. All right. So before we start, we can remove this enter file name prompt. And then when we create the file object, we're going to replace fname with the name of the file we just uploaded. And now for a prompt, we just want a single letter. So let's store that in a character variable. And let's call this query. Okay, and then for a buffered reader, once again, let's replace, oh, sorry, we don't need to replace anything. Okay, our buffer reader is all good. And we still want a string line to store the current words or whatever inside that line. Now in our while loop, we're just gonna do a quick check. So what we want to do as we're going through this file, we're going to store the current word inside the variable line. And then we want to check if the string line starts with the query letter that we want. This means that the first character in line has to be equal to the query. And so how we can access the first letter of the line is using the character at method. And since everything in a string is 0 index, then 0 is the first letter in the string. So if it's equal to the query, we're going to print out the line And then we still want to count the number of words. So outside of the while loop, we're going to create a counter variable. And then we're going to increment it. Once again, if the current line doesn't satisfy this condition, there's nothing we need to do. Okay, then at the end of the for loop, we can print out how many words there are. So counter words start with query. All right. So this is pretty simple. It's only some slight modifications compared to what we've done before. Now let's run this program. Small typo there. All right, so let's say I want to find the letter G. And as you can see in the console, all the words starting with G are getting printed out. And so this is quite lengthy, actually. Now let's check how many we have. So our output says that 2,676 words start with G. Let's try another letter. Maybe something less common like C. Once again, we're getting our list of words. And here in our output, 167 words start with Z. So this is pretty interesting and fun to play around with in your spare time. After we're done with this lesson, then you could potentially try a couple more letters and have fun with it. All right, so now let's make this a little more advanced. In a dictionary, sometimes after looking for the first letter, then you might want to look at the first few letters instead. So here, let's write a program that prints out and counts the number of words starting with a given sequence of letters. So now my query is no longer going to necessarily be just one letter. Here, it'll be a sequence of characters, meaning it's a string type. Now, one thing you may or may have not noticed is that in our text file, everything is lowercase. So let's say a query is all in uppercase. And, maybe there is a word that does start with those letters, but just in lowercase. But Java doesn't know this, and it'll just return a 0 for us. So we can fix that by converting everything in query to lowercase. There's a handy method for this. All right. So now when we're reading every line, you want to check if that line begins with the query. And so we can use a string method called starts with for this. So here we're checking if the line starts with the query. If it does, we're going to print out this word, and then we'll update the counter. And our final line of output will be the same. We print out the counter, and then the number of words start with our query. So now let's run this and test it. Oh, sorry. And you also want to update the prompt, of course. So you could say, enter a prefix you want to find. So let me try something like this. HUI. I don't know if there's a word or not that begins with that. And apparently there are. So for my output, I get those two words, and then two words start with this prefix. Let's try something else. Now in this case, no word starts with AGIR. So for my output, I get 0 words start with the prefix I just entered. So once again, this you can also play around with. It's pretty fun. Overall, what we did was a lot more like what we do in real life, searching for a dictionary. And with that, you can kind of see the beauty of programming. We can take real world problems and then write a program to make a computer solve them more efficiently. All right, so that was our last exercise for today's video. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.